selves. So I'm going to say a little bit about the nature of consciousness from a few perspectives, and then Aaron's going to offer some practices that help us engage with consciousness. So I studied cognitive science as an undergrad, and consciousness was always kind of on the periphery of that discipline. I chose cognitive science because it's very interdisciplinary, so I got to take courses in philosophy, neurobiology, computer science, linguistics, and consciousness came up once in a while, but for the most part, it was kept on the periphery. And the reason that I kept hearing from cognitive scientists was that it's just, everybody has a different definition of what consciousness is. So, until we can narrow in on an agreed upon and operationalizable definition that we can then use in experiments, why would we even talk about consciousness? And thanks, Chad.
Nice work, thank you.
And I always, as I continued to study philosophy, I was learning about, Immanuel Kant and what he referred to as a transcendental perspective, a transcendental method, and the German idealists. I've been studying them for years, but I was first exposed to them as an undergrad and studying about the phenomenological tradition that came out of German idealism. And what I came to believe is that actually there's a pretty refined history of discourse around consciousness that's defined it pretty precisely, and there's a whole dialectic involved in arriving at that understanding of consciousness. And it's not just about consciousness as a thing that we study. It's consciousness as an environment that we inhabit, you could even say, or as an activity that we are. So there is a participatory dimension in this philosophical lineage, and it seemed to be totally left out of cognitive science and the way that the mind was being studied from a scientific perspective within academia. So what I want to lay out are two perspectives, basically the transcendental, and I'm speaking in general terms here, but the transcendental and phenomenological perspective on consciousness, and then on the other hand, the perspective on consciousness that comes more out of neuroscience, neurobiology, and cognitive science, and to show how these two perspectives may at first appear quite opposed to one another, but my hope and a lot of my own thinking and research is in an effort to take what is obviously true about each of these perspectives and marry them into something more integral. So the transcendental or phenomenological perspective on consciousness is that, if we were to ask what's the nature of consciousness, well, it's the condition which makes possible everything that we know and everything that we experience. It's sort of, for us to, as a scientist, claim to know something about the natural world, from a transcendentalist perspective, that's all fine until we try to turn the lens back on our own capacity to have that knowledge. And from a transcendentalist or
There's a lot of syllables there.
Phenomenologist's perspective, you can't turn the objectifying scientific method back on the subject, because it turns out that the subject is the site wherein knowledge is made possible in the first place. And the scientific method, natural science, presupposes this, that this would be the transcendental argument, that there's a certain structure of consciousness, and that structure comes, from Kant's perspective, pre-installed with certain categories that allow us to understand what an object is in the first place. So without that structure of consciousness, natural science wouldn't even be possible. So consciousness becomes this a priori condition for the transcendentalists. On the other hand, you've got a neurobiological perspective where when you ask what is the nature of consciousness, the answer is, well, it's some kind of information processing, right? Where if there is something like consciousness or mind, it's kind of like the analogy is it's the software and the brain is the hardware, right? And there's been a research program ongoing for decades pursuing that sort of explanation of consciousness. And from a phenomenological perspective, that is to objectify something that is always going to be behind our attempts to objectify, that it's always going to be the condition making possible any objective description. Now, obviously, the brain and consciousness are intimately related. I don't think there are many people who deny that. So the question for me becomes, how do we hold this understanding that clearly there's some type of relationship between the brain and the body, the organism, let's say, and our conscious experience, with this more phenomenological, transcendental approach where, I can't get behind the condition of my own knowing in order to objectify it and understand it as some sort of scientific object. I'm always presupposing the categories of my own understanding. I'm always presupposing the sensory organs that I happen to possess as the conditions for my knowledge of anything. All right? So this is what has driven me to take seriously a perspective that's called Panpsychism, which is the idea that it's not that human consciousness is fundamental and irreducible. It's not only that human consciousness is somehow transcendental and that we can never explain it scientifically by objectifying it. It's that consciousness is intimately related to the physical world and has always been intimately related to the physical world. And the brain, the human brain, is an especially complicated expression of that relationship between consciousness and the physical world, such that, an example that I think highlights this connection between neurochemistry and consciousness is psychedelics. It's kind of a paradox that psychedelics produce such mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, while at the same time being clearly chemical in their mode of action. They're affecting our brain such that we begin to have experiences that make it pretty obvious, to me at least, that consciousness can't be reduced to the brain. So if we look at, from the neurobiological perspective, the brain has evolved over the course of hundreds of millions of years. One of our fellow earthlings, the octopus, is a very complex brain, but it's been evolving independently of the human brain for 500 million years. And yet there's been enough of a convergence in evolution along these separate lineages that a drug like MDMA also has this pro-social effect on octopuses. This is pretty recent research. Octopuses are usually pretty asocial. They don't like to be near each other unless they're mating. And on the right dose of MDMA, they, similar to the ratio that you would give a human being, so the first time they did this experiment, it's kind of angering from an animal rights perspective, but they weren't sure how to administer the MDMA, so they just dissolved it in a beaker of water and dropped the octopus in it, and they gave it a huge dose. massive dose. And then they put 2 octopuses in the same tank, and on that huge dose, they both immediately shot to the opposite corners of the cage and were like looking around really scared.
They're like, what is that thing?
And then they thought, okay, we'll give it a more reasonable dose that we might give a human being. And these 2 octopuses started hugging each other, like wrapping their tentacles around one another and embracing for an hour and a half. And then it wore off and they shot back to their opposite corners again. So here's this nervous system of an animal that's been evolving separately from the human nervous system for 500 million years, and this chemical has the same effect. For at least it appears to have the same effect. So it seems like there's something about the it's not the MDMA molecule in any psychedelic molecule or any neurotransmitter. There seems to be a kind of qualitative signature, an interior dimension to these molecules that resonates with the brain in such a way. And it's cross-platform, right? I mean, the brain of the octopus still works on serotonin, and it's similar enough that this result isn't completely surprising, but 500 million years of evolving apart from one another. And so it seems like there's some quality in the molecule of MDMA itself that we participate in. And so in the panpsychist universe, it's not that there isn't a chemical basis of consciousness, it's that those chemicals are proto-conscious in some way. And when we ingest them, we participate in that consciousness, and it alters our normal human consciousness. So, what do you think about that, Aaron?
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. It's all ritual. So, is everyone hearing us okay? Obviously, this is not playing a role in that. Is everybody okay? This is for the benefit of the recording. Okay. So, I think part of what's at stake in this conversation about the nature of consciousness and what to do about it is the significance of matter, or the discourse on materialism, for discussions about consciousness and for discussions about our own strivings and desires as spiritual seekers. What's interesting, what's kind of at stake here, is that by way of various arrangements of material energies and substances, consciousness becomes empowered to thematize for itself its own origins and structures. There's a deep mystery there, because it's in terms of our manipulation of what is taken to be an object of consciousness, which would seem to be separated off by definition from the sort of engine of consciousness. By virtue of manipulating something about experience, experiencing becomes available as a kind of experience. And so there's a sort of introduction of plasticity into the ground. And that's what I find exciting about this conversation, is sort of developing a discourse on the plasticity of the ground. So a kind of continuing negotiation between ourselves, our Dasein, or our being in the world, and the conditions that necessarily constrict us and set the parameters of our degrees of freedom. So you can see why this is a kind of spiritual discussion, even if we're talking about animal studies, etc. Is that all clear enough? So I don't really have much to say about octopus neuroscience in detail. I just want to kind of draw out some of why this is interesting. So one thing, another way to put this is to talk a little bit about renegotiating the status of matter. And I'm going to do this initially by way of a quote from good old Karl Marx from his theses on Feuerbach. He says, "The principal defect of all materialism up to now is that the external object, reality, the sensible world, is grasped in the form of an object or an intuition, right? As something sort of sensed, but not as a concrete human activity, as practice, in a subjective way. So did you catch that? The defect of materialism is that it is not grasping material as concrete practice. Okay? I think that's really illuminating and getting at, again, from another angle, what's at stake for Matt and me here. So I'm not interested in litigating the question of panpsychism versus eliminativism or other forms of materialism or reductionism, so much as I am interested in mining these discourses for insights about praxis, insights about what's possible for us as conscious agents. So that's what I have to say about that for now.
So, in the study of consciousness, if practice is relevant, if we are, as self-conscious beings, capable of a kind of autoplasticity,
Yeah.
then the way that we study is having an effect, whether we're aware of it or not, on the nature of that which we're studying. So I've always, the reason that I feel that there is something important at stake in these debates between materialism and eliminative materialism is an especially, I think, consistent and rigorous form of materialism that just says, it's not that consciousness can be explained by reduction to the brain, it's that there never was anything like consciousness in the first place. We're all deluded by the way that we speak. And in fact, as science advances, we'll just change the way we speak, and consciousness will no longer be a word that we use, and there won't be a problem for us to try to solve about how consciousness emerges from the brain. It doesn't, because there is no consciousness. That's the eliminativist perspective. And the reason I think there's something important at stake, even ethically significant at stake, is that if we study consciousness, or what we call consciousness currently, but really is just a language game or something, as though it's not real, we end up, if it is real, eliminating our capacity to be conscious. So if we treat human beings like computers, then after a little while, we start to become more computational, more algorithmic. So I've always, when people ask, like, when will the AI wake up? Because computers are getting faster and faster, and their ability to process more and more human-like. I'm less concerned about tracking how much faster computers are getting than how much slower human beings are getting. Because we're using computers so much now, we're becoming more machine-like as the machines are becoming more human-like, and we're going to meet in the middle somewhere, maybe.
Yeah.
But so the point is, if consciousness is something that is plastic, the way that we study it matters for what it becomes next.
Okay. Thanks, that's helpful. So I guess I kind of want to back up and say that, or confess that something that I'm up to here is a kind of an attempt at a revival or initiation of a kind of Neo-Hermeticist kind of philosophical magic. And so that's very much to do with finding ways to come to terms with those formative principles that are in some sense alive in us and I think responsive to what we do. And so maybe eliminativism is unhelpful for that, and so we can abandon it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not trying to get into a debate about that right now, so much as I'm trying to sort of bring about a new Hermetic millennium.
Wow.
So, you know, I would like for us to be able to speak responsibly about consciousness, responsible to the science of consciousness, in a way that appropriates scientific discourse for Hermetic ends. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, Hermeticism can be broadly distinguished into theurgy and thaumaturgy. So you're talking about the invocation of gods or angels, the attunement of one's own will with the larger sort of cosmic will of God or the universe. And in doing that, attaining a sort of sanctification that enables you to appropriate your birthright. What is your birthright? Your birthright is your participation in cosmic creativity as such, with all of its powers and
risks,
privileges. And the only way you do that is by attuning your will to that of the cosmos. So there's a kind of transformative practice of attunement that happens by way of invocation. And then, thaumaturgy as the working of magical miracles, making things change in accordance with your will, happens as a sequelae of that, right? So magic is always done in accordance with the cosmic will, which you attune to in a theurgical process. So that's a kind of straightforward, kind of golden dawn Neo-Hermeticism. And I think that's something that all of us are interested in doing. Astrological practice, we don't thematize this very much in our discourse on astrology, but it is a form of magic. I've heard Rick talk about this before.
Yeah, there's a phrase that the poet Gary Snyder said is, know at least two forms of magic.
Thank you. Yeah, so some of us were just talking about this very thing just before. That's kind of cool. So I guess it's weird because I'm trying to kind of demythologize Hermeticism by using the discourse of transcendental philosophy and phenomenology and neuroscience and activism and these other kinds of things to be able to kind of put a kind of Hermeticist ethos or in these terms and thus to energize it for a new population of spiritual aspirants. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I'm trying to do with you in this conversation about the nature of consciousness and what to do about it. Mm-hmm. And so, another thing that I draw from quite a bit is the whole sort of Sanskrit and Tibetan vocabulary of Buddhism, which has been doing its own kind of indigenous cognitive science for the last 2,500 years. And so last year I was talking about, it was still 2018, last academic year when we were here, I was talking about this idea of swasamvedana, which would mean something like, literally, it's kind of like feeling with oneself. And so it's a kind of dynamic, right? Vedana is kind of feeling, and sam, it's like with it, and swa, self. Okay, and so what that means is a kind of self-reflexive component of consciousness, a correlate with every sort of intuition or sensation or thought is a concomitant event in consciousness which recognizes consciousness of that. Does that make sense? Consciousness of each event in consciousness. And then I mentioned that there are practices that you can do, meditation, that will sort of empower that dimension of our organismic response to our total environment. And then that has implications ethically and artistically and politically because it changes the speed with which we find the resources to respond ethically to developments in our environment. And so, that's something that's pretty fascinating to me because, and I'll tell you why. Swasamvedana, or a kind of bare self-reflexive consciousness, is something that I wouldn't even call first person, right? The subject, or the sense of me being kind of walking around and acting as an agent or receiving experiences as a subject of experience, I think is actually after this dynamic of self-reflexivity. So there's something about consciousness that can be discovered in experiential processes, which is not limited to the first-person perspective. Okay? And I think that is inherently transformative of our personality and of our sense of what's possible for us and what we might aspire to, and what we are, in fact, capable of responding to. And so that's what I hope.
Thank you for laying out your project. I think what you're describing...
Hopefully it relates to the subject of this talk.
Revival of Neo-Hermetic magical practice.
Right. I don't usually bring that out, but that really does motivate me a lot.
Yeah. So again, what I feel is at stake here is that what you're advocating here is a kind of white magic, putting our will in alignment with the cosmic will.
Fair enough, yes.
There's a form of black magic being practiced by advertisement, the advertising industry, and with
The political machine.
the political machine and the economic machine, where, you mentioned how there's something deeper than our first person experience. There's
And yet still conscious.
still conscious, but there's something in reserve, held in reserve of
Yeah,
what's normally at the surface when we're just going about our lives as who we think we are.
yeah.
And the thing is that machines are now smart enough, these algorithms are smart enough to know what we desire before we even know that we desire it. And there's the pop-up on my phone telling me I want this product because it was listening to my conversation the other night about how, whatever, I really need a new brand of Q-tips or whatever. And it's like, bam.
I could use a new brand of Q-tips.
I don't think there is one, that's why we call them Q-tips.
Right.
All right.
Problem for another talk. But
The wait continues.
so we have this in the West, a sense of political orientation around the notion of a liberal subject, a subject who's free, can be held morally responsible, can make economic choices that are rational and self-interested. But the problem is that the advance of these computer algorithms has shown that we're not actually as free as we thought. And so there's a way in which these black magicians who work for the PR industry can manipulate our opinions because of how addicted we are to social media and having a certain perspective mirrored back at us. And so we're in dire need of a form of, if this is black magic, we need to
Yes.
cultivate a form of white magic
Yeah.
that would allow us to, in a sense, resist this colonization.
That's right.
And because consciousness is so plastic, whatever freedom is, it's deeper than the kind of liberal freedom
That's right.
that that it was a good idea for a few hundred years in the West, and it brought about a lot of great things for a lot of people. It took a few hundred years for it to be more than just white property-owning males, but this notion of this liberal subject with rights and so on, it's done a lot of good for the world. But our technologies are advancing to the point where we need a deeper conception of what the human being is, and recognizing that we're not just born as free individuals. Like, a free individual doesn't just erupt out of the mud,
Yeah.
capable of exercising its rights.
Yeah, as such.
That needs to be constructed, because the consciousness is plastic. And we create that notion of an individual in a certain type of community and cultural context. And if that context is no longer relevant, because the technology has advanced to the point that our consciousness is being manipulated at a level deeper than our own first-person knowledge of it, then we need these magical practices that you're speaking to resist.
That's right.
We're in the midst of a sorcerer's war, I would say. So, do you have any tips for
Battle strategies.
battle strategies?
What was that? Any spells? Yeah. Well,
We have a board over here.
spells. That's a little deeper. Yeah, I like this. I like this framing of things. So there's an imperative for us to sort of participate a little bit more in the manipulation of our experience.
Yeah.
Not just to be sort of consumers.
Because if we don't do it ourselves, we'll be shaped
Yeah.
by others.
Yeah, that's right. So every time you have a thought, you are engaging the machinery of the social, political, kind of capitalist paradigm. Every time you think anything whatsoever, you're engaging that precise machine. Every time you think something that you think is private, you're doing that. Doesn't matter whether it results in you making a different purchasing option. Every single time you do that. So what does it mean to live in a world that moves at that speed, at that subtlety? That is, in fact, the world that you live in now. And so, until you're able to take the reins of that, you better at least become deeply devoted to some saving power that can sustain you with an intelligence far greater than yours. But most people don't have either of those. And so that's a sad, difficult, scary situation. So my first tip is to identify and give yourself from your chest to a saving power that sustains you with an intelligence and a will and a beauty and grace and power and love that's beyond anything you could ever contrive. And devote yourself to that perfectly. So that's another thing that I'd like to talk about, is that this all sounds very much like we're developing a kind of new tech, right? And I think this discourse is going to be appropriated, if not already, extremely quickly by people who seem like our allies, but they aren't. Very close to us. And so, once again, it only becomes more and more important to remember how important devotion is to this process. Theurgy precedes, that is to say, attunement of one's will to the divine, precedes your right to change anything. So you will never go wrong by devoting yourself to that love. Join your prayer to the river of prayer that exceeds all time. I mean, that's what it is. And so kind of what we're doing is sort of reviving a kind of religious sensibility in a way, but outside of the discourse of religion, outside of the institution that has pathologies like, rampant pedophilia and all these other things that are there in Catholicism and Buddhism, monastic culture and all those kinds of things. The news that's going to be coming out about Buddhist sort of scandals regarding sort of sexuality and financial misappropriation in monasteries, it's only going to be worse and worse. It's going to be really sad for a lot of folks who are devoted to these things. And so it really just puts a fine point on your own personal kind of surrender to that sort of cosmic love. Does that make sense? Is this kind of connecting for everybody?
Definitely.
Okay, good. So that's sort of it. It's kind of a reappropriation of certain kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of religious sentiment or religious emotion. But you can see why we're doing this, because we're trying to mobilize these kinds of powers for a form of transformation and resistance that has everything to do with all of the social and ecological and political struggles that we're involved in, but also relates to our destiny eternally. So that's kind of what integral looks like today, right? We're not talking about this sort of constructing some new sort of representation or model of things that's got all the different levels and quadrants and lines that we could ever imagine. That's not what integral means. Okay, now you.
Well, we've been speaking for about a half hour.
Oh yeah,
I
now
wonder
you.
if we want to open this up.
Yeah.
Sean?
Go ahead, Paul.
Chad, should we just...
Is that good?
Chad,
Because I
should we
can't hear
just...
myself. I only just kind of talk.
Should we pass this mic or just use this? Okay.
Just speak loud.
Yeah. Paul?
Is the question what to do about it or what to not do?
Or
Repeat the question.
is the question what to do about it or what to not do?
What's the it?
Consciousness. The nature of consciousness.
I'm referring to non-doing, which in the Taoist tradition would be called Wu Wei, which also has extensions in Buddhism.
Yeah.
I think you're familiar with what I'm talking about.
I'm trying to become
What
familiar
actually
with it.
does one do?
I think it's easy to...
Actually the problem.
I think it's really easy to overthink that because you get into this whole mystery rhetoric of non-doing, and then you get like koans and their responses. But, when it comes down to it, we need to do something. We're just normal folks. And so that's why I brought in devotion. I do think that devotion is an important kind of component here. Devoted to what? I don't know. So I don't have all the kind of answers to that.
But Sean does.
But Sean, I think does.
Well, to me, this is precisely the question devoted to what, and unless, unless I am willing to struggle with that for as long as it takes to, and again, to be committed or confident that I'm kneeling, to the right God or goddess, then I think I failed, and people have failed in the task. Yes, there are many people that are devoted to ultimate concerns.
Yeah.
And are ready to kill for it.
Sure.
So, and this is where the Enlightenment tradition, and it's not just the Enlightenment, but the tradition that it's related to your idea of
Swa-samvedana, yeah.
So it's kind of proprioception, also
yeah.
related to the Transcendental movement.
Sure.
Of self-reflexivity and being conscious of what one does to the extent that it's possible, maybe gives us a clue in the direction of how we might discern which god or goddess to worship, or how to worship at least. Because there's different ways of worshiping. Dylan, you've got to serve somebody, right? It may be the devil, it may be the Lord. You've got to serve somebody, but there are different versions of who the Lord or the lady is, right? So this is the question. So
Yeah. Okay, sure. So I take it that the psyche has a kind of profound capacity to see things as faces, to see things as persons. Personalization is an inherent activity of the soul. So to see things through the eye of the soul, in some sense, is to see them as responsive as persons. So I leave it to the psyche to provide the faces and the names. But what I'm interested in is really kind of considering all this within a kind of second-order discourse. We're kind of abstracting it a little bit. We're using cog-sci and phenomenology and stuff to be able to talk about these things abstractly, and in that way to attain some control over them. So it's not only about simply finding what you desire. I mean, this is why I was having a little bit of tension with you last night. It's not simply about devotion for devotion's sake. It's about having some control about what that means. And so for me, I'm very compelled by a notion, the Buddhist notion of bodhicitta, as an idea that tries to have, it works to attain abstractly, in a sense, the best motivation. And so what does that mean? So we want the most extreme form of benefit that we can possibly imagine, and we want it to have the biggest scope that it can possibly have in space and time. And so that is what we're going for. And let the psyche personify that, and then let that be the object of your devotion. And that's that kind of river of prayer that I was talking about. It's the most beneficial and most expansive, most powerful, miraculous possibility. So it's not something that's rooted simply in your assent to a kind of scriptural sort of doctrinal statement. I think it has a reason behind it. It's fairly simple. So that's how I come to what you're doing there. And I try to come to terms with myself as a philosopher who needs reasons for things, and also as a devotee who loves, the goddess or whatever.
If I may add just a coda to that then.
Sure.
As you're well aware, in the Buddhist tradition, the twin values of wisdom and compassion,
Yeah.
and they're sort of joined in Buddhist.
Yeah, that's true.
But from the Western tradition, going all the way back to Plato and the idea of wisdom, that to my mind, in a sense, culminated, at least for the first time, not forever, by Hegel, who gave us a clue at least of how to think of wisdom in terms of coherence in an integral way. It seems to me that we have some guideposts here on how we can discern whether or not our devotion is misguided, whether or not it's likely to bear fruit, and to make progress in our self-reflexivity, bringing the heart to bear to our world.
That's great. Thank you for that. I find that Hegel is more and more important to this conversation, so I'm looking forward to learning more from you about
Yeah.
Hegel.
Is this in the same? Yeah.
So I don't mean to be hogging them.
You're not. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I can piggyback on what's just been said. But
Why don't you do that?
Do that.
It's great to hear
okay,
from you.
it has to do with, in a way, what we're doing is complexifying the very valuable layout of what you've given us to start with. And just as you just did with the idea of, well, there's devotion, but devotion, can go in a number of ways.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, in terms of magic and the revivification of a Neo-Hermetic, and the value of magical practices. And in a way, PCC is, we're talking about Harry Potter last night and everything, and yet we are a kind of
That's right.
graduate school Hogwarts.
That's why we've chosen to be in this room for this conversation.
So I think we need to look at in PCC, for example, two of our practices are psychedelics and astrology, both of which are magical practices, and that brought and you, Matt, complexified what Aaron had said by saying, well, there's black magic, there's white magic, which I think we probably need to deconstruct that term.
Sure.
Probably not use black magic and white magic. As you pointed out, part of what the white magic is supposed to do is to get the white man out of
Right,
some
right.
Of course.
power. So if we think of it maybe as some, like say benign magic and malign, that the thing is, even the practices of both astrology and psychedelics also have moral bivalence. They too can have destructive, wounding consequences. People get astrological readings all the time that are wounding. People take psychedelics regularly without necessarily the greatest consequences. Could be quite destructive. These are magic. Even the positive, potentially very benign, life-enhancing forms of magic have tremendous destructive shadows.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just bringing, that was the point of my talk a couple of years ago about the hidden heart of PCC, and one reason why that's hidden, those two forms of magic that we do have as part of our community, is that they're dangerous in the wrong hands, or even in the right hands, that without adequate grace or all sorts of other factors that could play a role. So I guess I'm just, everything that you guys have just said, and both of you added over here, is just so crucial, and I guess adding another level of, I guess, kind of moral reflexivity to the discussion.
It's very valuable. That was what I had in mind with theurgy as an attunement with a kind of the highest possible intent. I think that's important for determining the difference between benign and malign praxis.
Can I say one more
Do you want to hold this for a minute?
in light of this?
Yeah.
I mean, another one of our practices is reading
Yeah.
and scholarship.
Totally.
And it is just as powerful as anything else, as Jake was saying this morning. Another practice is writing and creating. These are powerful practices. And they're magical, for sure. And I love the way the discussion goes off in devotion and the esoteric and so forth. But it's also good to remind ourselves that we're connected to a very straightforward devotion. We would like a world where children can actually drink water that's healthy. We would like a world where we're educating, all the young girls over the planet. I mean, this is what we're devoted to.
Yeah.
And I like the way you said the soul has this innate urge to personify, but just to remember what we're really about. We're about a vibrant earth community. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Completely.
Thanks, Brian, for bringing that. It's very simple when you phrase it in that way. And, you know, in response to Sean's question about devotion and how do we know we're devoted to a deity that is serving the earth community. And then when Aaron, you first brought up our innate proclivity to see faces, I thought you were going to go in the Emmanuel Levinas direction, but you went in the James Hillman direction.
I did, yeah,
but
that's right. I had
there's
Hillman
this-
more in me than Levinas.
There's a phenomenologist, a Jewish phenomenologist named Emmanuel Levinas, who made a big deal about the phenomenology of the face.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was critical of thinkers like Hegel and German idealists for what he perceived to be this attempt to arrive at a closure of knowledge. And Levinas would say that knowledge depends in the first place on a certain ethical relationship to other people, other faces, and that the face of another person it commands us to let go of any idea of self-closure, like that we could be certain in ourselves of anything. And the thing is, Hegel was very much aware of the intersubjective ground of consciousness. Another German idealist, Fichte, would talk about the way that my own self-consciousness is bound up in a dialectic of mutual recognition with other self-conscious beings, and that I don't come to my own self-awareness without facing others who are aware of themselves. And it's in that mutual recognition that we raise each other to consciousness, so that there's an openness, a lack of closure to what self-consciousness ultimately is, that brings in this ethical component. So if we're devoted to anything, someone like Levinas, I think, despite his misreading of German idealism,
Yeah, it's a misreading of Hegel.
he's inviting us to consider the ethical call of the face of other people, but we can expand Levinas to say the face of other species, the face of the earth itself, to remind us that consciousness is not mine, it's not yours, it's ours. We discover it in this relationship. It exists between us. And so in that context, devotion always remains subject to relationship.
So I just wanted to supplement devotion. I want Laura to speak and others who have their hands up. But I don't want to forget the initial training that I was talking about in terms of sort of an empowerment of inherent organismic capacities for responsiveness that are within the field of conscious experience, and yet, in a sense, more fundamental than what we call the first-person perspective. Mm-hmm. And so the way that I'm thinking that those kinds of inherent organismic capacities are energized and sharpened and refined is through very basic practices that don't yet bear upon devotion as such in some of these larger kinds of ethical relationships. And I'm talking about these famous Buddhist practices of shamatha and vipassana, by which I mean the attainment of a kind of calm abiding, a sort of focus, right? And a kind of peace that comes with an increased sort of focused attentiveness on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a kind of panoramic vision that occurs through a combination of both the quieting of the mind that's achieved in shamatha, but then a relaxing of focus. And so those two kinds of capacities, the condensation of attention, and then its breadth, the expression of its vast scope, on the other hand, again, I'm claiming that they speed up your ethical responsiveness. So yes, it's true that philosophy or knowledge or wisdom is rooted in responsibility. And it's also the case that by undertaking certain trainings, which ought to be understood on the model of something like martial arts or sports training, that kind of thing, by doing these kinds of trainings, it makes a whole new kind of ethical horizon open up, a whole new sort of area or arena of action that we've always been in, didn't even know it. And so that's part of what's at stake for me in the idea of autoplasticity or the plasticity of the ground or these other kinds of phrases that I like to use. So it's not just devotion. I don't think that devotion itself takes care of the whole thing. So we had Laura and Chad, we got Teresita.
I was just thinking about, triggered, inspired a little bit by what Matt was saying about black magic and white magic, or benign and malignant. And I do, what it brought up for me was just the reality of, like, the tradition has carried that polarity within it from the beginning. If you think of Zoroastrianism, and like the roots of this are in that constant striving and relating with the dark forces and the light forces, and negotiating between those and creating a relationship between it. And so I wonder to what extent devotion is possible without a constant questioning of who is here in front of me right now, because it's a cycle, right? Every moment is a cycle of what light and what dark force is sort of coming and going. And that makes sense, right, in that sort of biological or cosmological sense as well. And so just to kind of put that out there, that it's not a contemporary issue that we're facing. This has been built into the system from day one, and it may or may not be an inherent part of existing, an inherent part of magic, an inherent part of anything wherein there is will or power. So just to kind of...
Fantastic reflections. Very valuable, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first? Okay, so this is somewhat of a hypothesis. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been really amazing. And I think I'm going to touch on everything that everyone said. I mentioned it to Ashton after his talk because of the nature of, like, objectivity and...
Could you speak a little louder for me?
Yes, I'll try to.
Thanks.
Basically, I think that the astrological perspective has a magic that allows us to see ourselves in a more objective way with each other. And if we have the devotion to hold each other and check each other in our biases, there's a way in which it provides a lens into how we all perceive the world. And it requires a lot of care on all of our parts to do that, but it can provide a window into the moral dimension of reality, because we can see how people are embodying certain aspects of amoral dimensions or unmoral, and we have a collective position on that. Is that making sense?
Yep.
Like, there's a way in which, like, the devotion can be, and it is, I don't mean to make too much of it, but the astrological perspective grounds every human being in a meaningful cosmos. Every human being has their own relationship to the intelligence, and you can have your own relationship to each archetype. It's a conversation that you have with synchronicities and symbols that happen in your life relative to where the planets are. And we can all see that in each other's charts. So we have a devotional need.
That's because of your goodwill.
I was going to say the very same thing.
I'm just throwing it out there. It's just what I've been thinking about. I felt like
It doesn't have that effect because of a decision you've made about how to represent your world. It has that effect because of how you want to mobilize that representation for the benefit of beings.
Right. That's right.
And that's something that you have a capacity for, that you already had before you ever heard the word astrology.
Teresita?
So I was flipping through various great work this afternoon.
You were cartwheeling through it or flipping? I didn't hear that. Okay, you were flipping through it.
And new things jumped off the page at me, right? So what I heard him say really clearly was, we're not here to be in control. And that
Right.
the future is not going to be an outcome of the rationality of the plans we make,
That's great.
but it's rather about reintegrating into the wild earth community. And it's that wildness through which we're going to get guidance for the emergence of the ecozoic. So I'm curious about consciousness as a field, a wild field that we tap into maybe, and what is the relationship between consciousness and control? I mean, how much control do we let go of in like elevating our consciousness?
So again, for me, to put it in magical terms, surrender precedes the responsible use of magic. So if we're trying to create change in accordance with our own decisions or representations about how things are, whatever we say about what we're trying to do, then it's black magic or malign magic. At least because it lacks the requisite intelligence and perspective in order to properly shepherd the cosmos. The only one who can do that is cosmic. And so first, above all, and perhaps fundamentally, more than anything else, the question is, how do I align with that purpose? That is the imperative of this entire discussion. And the meaning of magic is to pose beyond anything else that you might want to do. How do I align with that? How do I participate in that? So all the tech stuff is kind of like postdoc. But the real fundamental kind of effort is this kind of attunement, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you for bringing Thomas Berry into the conversation. What I always find myself returning to in his thought is this notion that the universe is about celebration. That's why it exists. That's why we are here. And at some point, the industrial mode of consciousness strayed from that under the assumption that it could control things. Maybe the goal ultimately was better celebration, but we tried to control things too much, and celebration's about spontaneity, And when I think about, like Brian, what you were offering to us last night about the cosmic depth of what we normally consider to be human emotions, enjoyment, desire, what it awakens in me a profound sense of responsibility to the billion-year lineage that is alive in each of us in every moment, that whatever I am, whatever my first-person consciousness is, it's a very surface level, very temporary and superficial emergence of these vast depths that go back to the beginning of time. And so when we engage in a practice of questioning who am I, which is one way of engaging in philosophy, is to pursue that as an inquiry. We very quickly need to descend below that level and recognize that we're continuous with something that's not human. And it's a profound responsibility, and maybe devotion to the continuation of that process on behalf of cosmic celebration is one way of getting at what to do about it. Matt?
I think I sort of got caught up on your magic metaphor, not even a metaphor. The mechanism of the magic. I think Dawkins, with his meme idea, that spoke to this, materialist or even eliminativist notion of we can reduce it down to just this evolutionary thing in mental space, in conscious space. So, if you can speak for a second, what you think the imaginal realms of the auto-plasticity, the seeking new grounds, and how is that reaching, how is that seeking best practice?
Okay, so This is going to go a little bit beyond my qualifications, but fortunately we have people in the room who I think can say a lot about it. But I like to think about the notion of consciousness as sort of compensatory in a sort of in its logic and inner tension. And so you sort of tickle a mandala in order to kind of induce the foregrounding of its other aspects. So we call this shadow work and dream work and the whole mandala kind of logic. So I mean, there's way much more that I could say about that and about how like the explicit deployment of symbols in trying to work the kind of categories. But maybe that's all I need to say. There's a lot of different kinds of mandalas. Is that suggestive of a reply?
I think it's, it tickles a reply, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm not wording what I'm holding in my mind when I ask the question of the need to, or the benefit of understanding the process of conscious evolution from the interior, and how knowledge of that awareness aids in the autoplasticity.
Well, for me, the reason it's important is that a desire to accurately represent what's going on with us in our deepest commitments, I think that it opens us out into an irreducible pluralism of these kinds of efforts and struggles. And so that creates a kind of groundwork for us to be responsible in our cross-cultural communication. So that's part of why I think it's important for us to rationally reconstruct what it is that's tugging at our hearts. Okay, I don't want to talk too much. Go ahead.
I just wanted to offer the conversation around deep forces, powers, devotion, not romanticized devotion which is commitment and truth and beauty, as we continually meet that where it is, with the type of strength that requires. And this sort of idea of, like malevolent and benevolent forces, magic, the deep traditions that we're holding. And I keep hearing people talking about Hogwarts. And Harry Potter is such a sweet story, but there's a much better one about wizards and schools and the power of words. And stories are so important. I just want to assign everyone to read the entire Earthsea series
Sweet.
by Ursula K. Le Guin. The entire series. She started it in 1968 and finished it actually just this year, and it will be released in an illustrated version with a new short story that she added. And it is about forces and power and deep things that we do not understand, and words and how much they matter, and and who has power and who gets to speak and who gets to learn the words to speak the power. And it's just, I think that it's a much better story if we are going to bring in stories, which we should, to this work that we're doing.
Hogwarts was just said in a very lightweight.
Yeah, but I think that matters.
Jake is reading it to his child. So
Yeah, and I love Harry Potter, but I think that matters to the devotion that we're talking about. I am devoted, and my act of devotion in this moment is to ask everyone to think about the weight of their playful metaphors.
Yeah, that's great.
And the weight of the stories that they are carrying on. And I love Harry Potter, and I'll read it to my kids. I read it, it's like chicken soup, it's awesome. But Ursula Le Guin is the real
The real deal. And so a few of us came, instead of Hogwarts, we've called this little mystery school Hawk Farts. So I just wanted to share that. Hawk Farts.
Oh my, there's room for potty humor in the revolution.
So we've got that. That's another kind of thing we could consider.
What is there a practice for like eliminating certain images from your mind?
So we can do this when we have like a kind of practicum on this.
By the
But
way, I'm glad this has all been recorded.
but there's a basic practice common to a lot of these sort of art forms. It's called banishing, which is the ability to kind of clear the decks. And so, I mean, in what's called the chaos magic tradition, laughter, by the way, is considered a powerful form of banishing. But there's lots of other ways that you can do that. It's what time?
Holly had a question.
6:13. So I mean, we're okay. Dinner starts at 6:30. We're not cramping anyone if we go on a little bit more. Anybody?
Yeah.
Well, so Holly and then Vince after that. Go ahead first.
I think I heard you say, or at least allude to the idea of love as resistance.
Yeah,
Did
both
you
of
say that, or did somebody say that?
both of us are
Sounds like something
are
you
involved in that sort of thing.
Love as what?
as resistance.
Resistance.
And I've been thinking a lot about and writing a lot about this in my own kind of world. How shall we love? What are the qualities of love? Right? And we have a lot of writing about that already. I don't know that I have that much to add. One of the things that occurs to me the most, and that when we say the word love, we have a certain cultural understanding of it, right? That it's sort of, you know, like that's an easy concept of love. But I also am curious about this concept of love as fears.
Yeah, of course.
And love as sometimes driven from those fears, sometimes angry places.
Yeah.
That how does that activate a certain kind?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear you, Matt, but I don't think of love in this context as like a sentiment of positive regard. So, you know, a sort of small r kind of romanticist notion of it. I like to think of it, I mean, for me it's very simple. It's kind of like the desire to remove suffering and the desire to increase happiness. So, I mean, that's what I mean by it. But I'd like to hear you respond to what she said.
I'm fascinated by the way that like love and evil seem like inverses of one another, just like the word. And sometimes fierce love is necessary to push back against evil. And there was a point in my own ethical self-development when I realized that I'm not a pacifist. And it was not an easy process of coming to that realization, because I really respect Gandhi and King and thinkers who've said, look, pacifism is always the best approach. And I think there's a way in which there's a form of love that can be righteous, that's not taking prisoners. And who's qualified to wield that? I don't know. But it's a real thing. There is a type of love that it's not like vengeful love, it's not, motivated by anything but the highest good. But it's not always clear who's carrying that highest good in any given messy human moment. But I fully agree that there is a fierce love. And it's part of what we need to get in touch with to get through our moment historically. Yeah. Vince and then Monica.
I just wanted to talk about some thoughts on aspects of consciousness, Shamanam, Vipassana, I think what you and the calm abiding and panoramic vision. And I found this, I go out on 6-day retreats with these groups of people that kind of practice that. They start off with the pranayama, which is a breathing technique to kind of center yourself, and then you go into unbounded consciousness. And what people have found is they're able to actually remote view things and go to the next level. They make it practical as far as the way remote viewing and engaging reality at a deeper level. You have to really let go of attention in order to do that. You have to. It's translating from a consciousness of power and control, which seems to permeate our society, permeate our science, permeate the way we reflexively look on ourselves. Because you define, and when you define, you try to control sometimes, not always necessarily, but putting boundaries. I found that kind of getting into that, there's an accessible way to get into unbounded consciousness. That is very accessible to, at varying levels, people that enable us to kind of, be Shambhala warriors, spiritual warriors of a sense, and operate on there's a fierce love underlying that. There's very much a warrior love underlying that. I just wanted to say that that's a possible application that I've been seeing in other people, seeing develop in other people who are just run-of-the-mill, I won't say run-of-the-mill people, just they're not somebody who's spent a lot of time studying and practicing. They're people who their study and practice is the story of their life, which is, their study and practice is their story of whatever they do. So I just wanted to mention that the accessibility of that as a possible way of a possible future of humanity and our engagement in the cosmos.
Yeah, so for me that's all having to do with the kind of scope of implementation or praxis itself, and is rightly evaluated in a context of retreat. So it's a little bit different from what I've been trying to do today, which is sort of conceptually represent these problems. So I want to suspend questions about remote viewing and other sorts of, what goes under the rubric of siddhi. Because to me it's kind of just small s speculation outside of the context of direct implementation. So it's not to shut down at all what you were saying, it's just that I don't have much to say about it if we're not all doing lots of deep practice.
Monica, and then we'll break for dinner.
Okay, I really, I loved all of this, but I really love what you had to say, Matt, about that we raise each other to consciousness, and that the ethical call is in the face of other people, and discovered in relationship. That's what you said, and then we're talking about love, and we brought in Barry, so we must bring in Teilhard. And for Teilhard, love is the physical structure of the universe. So it's not a world of objects, it's a world of consciousness and love, which is matter in union, in relationship. So when we come face to face in consciousness, or when we come face to face, we're creating the world. We're making the world. We're world making in the direction of the future. Teilhard says to think the world is not merely to record it, but to confer on it a form of unity it would never have had it not been thought. So discovery and synthesis and all of our going forward is not just speculation, but it's creation on the insides of things.
Yeah, great. Beautifully put.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone.
That's a great one. but maybe we'll do part 3 someday.